Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Branching PathCast. I'm Marley, and I'll be discussing consequences, meaning, and endings in games. This is episode 3. Let's get right into it. RPGs and branching games vary widely in their structure. It seems like many more recent ones are taking the tack of organizing around one or several main branches that are the main decision points, with many smaller arcs that can be experienced within an otherwise fairly discrete section. Others may favor a more episodic kind of experience, where you may end up in a variety of highly contrast endpoints, each being recognized somewhat as the terminus point of the story. The experience of some of these games may be linked to seeing the diversity of events possible in a given game, watching choices ripple out into consequences. I suppose that the various structures that are possible all have their pros and cons, but even in looking at something that isn't as obviously choice-based, we can analyze interesting aspects in how it affects player experience. If we are looking at the first Mario game released in the West, we can see the design philosophy of Nintendo already strong, with a focus on the testing of mechanics in an incremental way, and exploring different ways in which it may be challenged. This and other early games focused on a dichotomous game state. You were alive or you were dead. There are other things, like power-ups, that alter you and your ability. However, the most dramatic instance is either perishing, completing a level, or finding a warp zone which allows you to bypass many levels. This segmented experience has largely continued, with many games favoring utter failure or progression rather than continuation. Although it makes sense in many respects, for these games have you milling through absurd amounts of enemies, and the inevitability of death along the way makes it seem likely that an optimal solution would be simply to allow the player to attempt the challenge again. I'm wondering if this is an area where we could benefit from exploring some alternatives to reflecting consequences of the player action in ways that are less dramatic. I am reminded of the improv rule, yes and, which means that you are only to validate and add on to what someone else is asserting, and that this seems like an ideal approach to supporting player expression. Some games like Shadow of Mordor, for instance, or the Sorcery series by Inkle, which I highly recommend, have explored more expressive reflections of consequences back onto the player to various degrees of success. I would say Sorcery has been one of my favorite implementations, and it seems to have a really good balance of restriction, expression, and payoff for player choices throughout the games. There are also points of death. However, there are many times where you are able to have non-optimal outcomes, and it is reflected forward alongside your progress, becoming a part of the story. I find this is a lot more meaningful and additive to the experience. And the story of Shadow of Mordor, I could not be more disinterested in it. But the system it runs off of is really special, where procedural rules generate a hierarchy of orcs that fight to be the head business orc. And the failure or success is extremely interesting in this game, because the orcs have quirks and spirits that reflect who they are and that change based on your encounters with them. So dying by an orc can lead them to receive a promotion, which is the road to becoming a somebody for a nameless orc. Next time you see them, they may have a hilarious moniker, a pirate hat, and a wrestling one-liner prepared. Beating them does not lead to their death necessarily, and they may recover, sporting a peg leg in place of the one they lost in the previous foray. There's more to it, but it's a simple and really engaging system. There are games that are more focused on mechanical feel, and the drive is more heavily weighted towards mastery of systems or manipulation, but for the games that have an interest in reflecting player choice across the world, an outright failure point can be an impactful experience. However, it is also going to detract in a sense. So it can be looked at as a double-edged implement, which I suppose most design decisions are. It reminds me of someone saying something that is not allowed in a courtroom, and the content being declared as not submissible in court. There is content that branches off into a dead-end state, and after the experience, it is fragmented and removed from the overall story. And in many cases, I feel it could be more impactful if that was accounted for differently. There could still be consequences that are grave or greatly impactful, but removing death states in favor of consequences that must be dealt with may make it a more fulfilling experience. Interactive fiction has long played in this space, and the fun of choose-your-own adventures was to explore the world and experience the strange deaths and often non-sequitur occurrences. At the same time, with creativity, some games may benefit from doing away with the foundational fail-state behavior. Many core loops revolve around destruction, and I would be lying if I claimed I did not enjoy it. There are games that are exploring different aspects, and veering away from violence is the core mode of expression. Doing away with the core assumptions of what a game is may open up designers to create new experiences and tell different stories. There is a dissonance that comes from having the character be brought to their knees in grief at the death of someone after they have spent 20 hours taking the lives of thousands of beings, destabilizing entire ecosystems, and having no reaction, barring a celebratory one. There are a lot of ways to play out consequences, but the difference between the moment-to-moment actions of the player and the story that is being told is often jarring and bizarre. There was a moment in the Idle Thumbs podcast where Steve Gaynor, I believe, discussed the shock his dad experienced to seeing someone killed, only for the exact same person to be encountered a short time later. These kinds of things that were part of a technical limitation are things that people become quickly blind to. Things and people disappear when they are no longer relevant to the player, and there are types of beings that simply all look the same. This doesn't have to be the case only because it is easy and because people are blind to it. I'm a little off topic, perhaps, but I do feel this is still relevant. It really does become easier to depersonalize what you are doing when you are killing the same person. It takes away their humanity to some extent. They are not an individual, they are just part of the masses. This is another way that consequence may not be fully explored. It blunts the impact to some extent, and just because you are consciously not aware of it or have accepted the media contract that these things are just how games are, it does not really dampen the effect that it has on you. People can't really just forget the likely provocative but not submissible thing that they heard. And beyond the experience that you are conscious of, the way things are perceived have a large impact on how the experience plays out. If there are people that dedicate a large amount of time to making realistic curtain physics, or blend complex mathematical shaders together to emulate realistic water while respecting the surroundings, taking into account light dynamics, and there is character customization that uses a multitude of dials, then there is a technology to generate consistently inconsistent characters by sliding around values. By assigning them a generative seed, they may hold on to their characteristics, and the variety of people encountered may be much more impactful. I'm not killing the storekeep who sells wands that create slugs 3 times a day. I'm killing Connor Phillips, the guy who got me through the many fights against the horse poachers with his finite quantity of dynamite and bandages. There is a relationship between consequence and meaning that isn't as clear-cut as may be first assumed. Oftentimes, philosophies are split between means-based and ends-based, so the import of the outcome being evaluated is once again split into a dichotomous framing, with either the performed actions and intended consequence versus shifting weight of the actualized outcome. Meaning is deeply subjective, as can easily be seen in various polarized issues, where both sides may use the exact same story thread and follow it with an asserted outcome that supports their view and frames the opposition in a negative light. The differential meaning derived from the input is based on subjective input. If the same information was used with the same perceptive framing, then the same conclusion would be drawn. Awareness is one of the more limited resources, and this is validated in the increasing efforts by companies to maintain attention above all else, rather than providing an experience that is fruitful and beneficial to the individual or fulfilling upon reflection. Consequence is a summation of the experience, reduced and framed within the context, and distorted by all the small moments experienced to that point. Meaning is not discrete instances, but a continuous process that rather ebbs and flows, and points of meaning may be understood as peaks and valleys in the meaning process, where there are either feelings of increased comprehension or increased confusion. As the mind is deeply interested in change, and meaning is about categorization of important flagged changes, then it makes sense that at a surface level, meaning may be recognized at times only through moments in which it fluctuates relatively dramatically. What is consequence, then, but another kind of meaning fluctuation point? The climactic events, or consequence points of arcs, are generally the resolution of building confusion and then the release of building tension. In other words, it can be understood as a peak in the process of continuous meaning, or the attentional separation, connecting, and flagging of the event and related events with the current situation. So consequence and meaning may be reduced to different amplitudes upon a spectrum, where they are contrast to previously recorded meaning points. Note that even though framing the meaning process is a continuous flow, the fragmented outputs of the meaning process are reduced to derivative points that then come to act as nodes with weighted edges to other nodes. This is all visualization, or a way to frame things, But I believe this is useful to think about, as although there is usually a line drawn between intent and consequence, I would like to challenge and play with this in order to push our understanding and allow for a different perspective on how consequence and intent is viewed. What makes something a consequence is subjective and requires the observer to have formed a chained narrative and to link together generated meaning, and then to have all those meaning points connect or lead into a conclusion meaning point. The meaning then framed from this highly integrated point can be understood as a summation of weighted edges and how they contribute to or detract from the main meaning arc. It may be that the connectors leading up to this point are linear chaining points that have been building off of each other. This is the stereotypical rising arc that is familiar to anyone who Googles storytelling structures. This can be done either with a payoff to the building plants that have been flagging the path, or through a subversion of what has been alluded to in the foreground. This is also a drastic reframing, either making everything make sense within a new context, or to make everything fit together that were once before now merely non sequiturs. These are all examples of things that can be done with a linear feed-forward chaining experience. The way that meaning is actually generated is a less straightforward affair. In real life, the experience of daily living can be somewhat forgettable, as when routine tasks are being performed, and there is nothing notable or interesting that occurs. The brain is extremely efficient in burning even the most complex tasks into lower circuitry, and taking that responsibility away from the conscious process in order to save energy and allow for more extensive organizational regions to be used for novel encounters, or those flagged as important in some way. The key to maintaining engagement in branching narrative in RPG games is to take this knowledge and use it to keep modulating the pace and flow. In some ways, this can only be done by providing the opportunities densely dispersed enough to allow for the natural chaining of these things by the player, as designed right, nudges to certain meaning frameworks may be more appealing when viewed from other meaning frameworks, and thus there can be an organically chosen pathway between different types of meaning categories. It is natural for rising tension to build the desire for a release and downbeat. You can also flip rapidly between certain framing states, such as going quickly from humor to horror, which work well because they are both stemming from the same underlying core feelings, and the incongruence or realization being either evaluated as trivial or grave. Consequence that is most engaging is when it stems not only from chaining one path, but from a multitude of chaining paths and moments, some of which are strongly contrasting to one another. The importance of dilemma in drama has been part of core Western structure for this reason. The irreconcilable nature is compelling because there needs to be a resolution, and at the same time, there is no understood acceptable resolution. Once again, the word dilemma can be understood as dichotomous choice with the amplitude and meaning cranked up to the max. With deft writing, those things may not be strongly set at odds at the beginning, but may both run alongside one another in parallel. The nature of games allows for storytelling that is more scattered and patchy than other kinds of media, and closer resembling real-life experiences. For example, Atelier Firis, The Alchemist and the Mysterious Journey, is extremely novel compared to many other games in how it deals with handling the narrative beats. I also love how this game synergizes all its systems together, but I'll focus only on narrative for now. The core game loop revolves around scouring the environment for ingredients, completing quests, and fighting monsters. While progressing towards your destination, you repeatedly find yourself at camping sites, where you may set up your portable atelier. Each time you enter, the tracking of where you are, your change in relationship to others, your ingredients collected, your quest progress, time since your last event, and I'm sure I've missed some other things, but it takes a lot of things into account to slowly lay out many different relationships and events in a fragmented and organic way. Each time you come back to your atelier, you are usually met with one or two stories that are very small and bite-sized. In response to many different tracks in which you are progressing, the different narratives continue in a manner that feels natural and keeps things engaging. This kind of somewhat decentralized storytelling is refreshing, and I would love to see more of it. And some of these discrete arcs terminate in their own climaxes, while others come together at times to culminate in more interesting ways. And the blend of things that seem more consequential within the slice-of-life moments that pepper the rest of the experience, it really does well to break up the experience. Games are generally extremely long relative to other types of media. They may have the opportunity to provide a multitude of endings or consequence points. They are also in the unique position of tracking and honoring the small moments throughout the journey, and rather than building the epic climaxes, the power of gaming narrative lies in the fragmented moments and the rippling of choices through the experience. In continuing to explore this area in which games are uniquely positioned to shine, we can push a more nuanced and cathartic experience, and tell stories that blend and breach genre frameworks, and provide experiences that tease out dissonance and provide freedom of choice alongside natural experiential pathways to offer an experience that other media types cannot. Coming back to the finality of endings and what it means for the experience, I would assert that in many games, it is a more fulfilling experience to have your choices flow through the space, but it is something that I believe is worth discussing. I wouldn't change Celeste or anything, but I feel it is worth thinking about more, and the ending is nothing without the journey. So I hope you found this interesting and are not put off by my somewhat tangential conveyance. I'll work on becoming a bit more linear in my own branching thought process. I'm Marley, and thanks for listening to Branching PathCast, Episode 3. Please subscribe for more information, and check out branchingpath.com for further blog posts, and let me know what you think. I'm aiming for weekly episodes. No comment on the blog rate, though. Please look in the description for a link on how to get in touch with me. Take care.